So, I mean, the rundown is it's pretty.
We're live. We're
Yeah,
live.
it's pretty big, the rundown, but there's some facts that I'm gonna mention because many people don't know them. Because essentially, there's a number of reforms that make Athenian democracy possible. The first one is something that's relevant to today's world. Is that Solon? He realized that it's impossible to achieve fair, equal participation in politics if you are essentially enslaved in debt. So one of the things he pushed for was a reform called sysachthia. And what it means is that you forgive all debts. So this becomes essentially the precondition to start off the democratic revolution in Athens.
You mind introducing yourself real quick?
My name is Alexandros Pagidas. I'm a Greek philosopher and entrepreneur. Here we are in Nix, which was the place where Athenians congregated and debated and voted on policies. You can actually see the podium right here, where speakers would try to convince their fellow Athenians that certain policies were right or wrong. So this is where we are. It's a beautiful day. And this is pretty much a public space that people can come here and hang out and see the sights. So this is what has become of the space.
So this is literally the place of democracy, the birth of it?
It is. It is. You see me being slightly melancholic because I always feel that we did not live up to the promise of this idea.
Why is that?
Because it's a huge story, but
Oh.
it's because we stopped believing that people are equal and that people can decide for themselves the laws under which they ought to live. That's pretty much the summary. Right now, what we have is representatives who supposedly we vote, depending on what sort of system you have. You might be voting for electors who then vote the representatives. But essentially, we vote for representatives who then look after our interests in the common good.
You should call them babysitters of democracy.
Well, yeah, but when the babysitter doesn't care about the baby, that's when the problems start occurring. Because who now today feels that they have a saying in what really is going on in this world? Unless you're in positions of power or you're a politician yourself or a big businessman or banker, you don't really feel as if you have much influence with respect to public affairs. Even though obviously you do have some influence. I don't want to sound completely cynical with respect to the power the citizenry has to influence affairs and even change the regime under which they live in. It's just that we have to be very pragmatic with respect to what actual influence do individual citizens have. You probably have heard of a study. It was by Northwestern and Princeton that was trying to figure out how much influence does the average American at least has on public policy, and what happens when the elites, economic elites or whatnot, would want to force a certain policy that goes against what the vast majority of the American public wants. And their conclusion was that when the elites agree with the vast majority of the American public, the law does pass and the thing is discussed, whatever issue that might be. But when they do disagree, then unfortunately, in most cases, it's the elites who set the agenda. That's why I think was a few years ago, I think it was Lawrence Lessig, one of my favorite public intellectuals, who mentioned how you had all these issues, these important social issues, and I think the first 5 months of a certain year of Congress was spent on discussing bank overdraft fees.
Wow.
Yeah.
I know that Greece has been going through economic crisis for about 8 years now. In your view of it, how do you think that's impacted the perception of democracy and the feeling of the citizens?
Well, I mean, it's a strange equation, really, because as many of you might have heard, there was a referendum in Greece, right? And the referendum was like very weirdly articulated, so many people didn't know what it was about. But many people thought that it was a way of protesting against austerity and the memorandums that we were asked to sign. So most people tried to protest with a no vote, right? And they thought that having a new government, especially like a leftist government, coupled with a fresh demand by the citizenry for a no to austerity, that government would have the guts to implement something that went against like the typical neoliberal policies that are being implemented, and generally austerity. But unfortunately, that didn't happen, and that government seemed to have taken that no and turned it to a yes. And I want to point out something with respect to the perception of democracy you talked about, because the referendum was around 60-40, right?
60-40 for no?
For no, yes.
Okay.
So
it was like no for paying back or study?
It was no to austerity, pretty much. It was no to another memorandum that hadn't worked for the past 4 or 5 years when it happened. It was 4 years.
Okay.
So remember that this was not a vote for a specific party, right? It's very important, which means that everybody, no matter what sort of political persuasion they had, participated. I think there was a very big turnout. I mean, a significant turnout. So they participated in this referendum. So in some sense, that was a very pure representation of the will of the people. It's interesting serendipity with applause. But unfortunately, despite that applause, the people's will wasn't really heeded to. So I think a lot of people became disappointed after that no was turned to a yes. And it was a blow to democracy, because usually the popular conception at least of democracy is that what happens in such a form of government is the will of the people, right? So that didn't really happen.
So that was the will of the banks that was...
Well, I'm not so sure you can disentangle the complex wills that are involved in political decision making. So I'm pretty sure that powerful banking interests were involved, but you have to understand that the banks had already won by that point, because the private debt that was owned by Deutsche Bank and all that stuff had already been bought and made into public debt by the time of the referendum, right?
Wow.
So in some sense, kind of the only chance that we had of truly saying a no that would hurt, that was with the then Prime Minister Papandreou. It wasn't with Tsipras. At that point, none of the toxic debt was at the hands of the banks. It was at the hands of the Greek state.
So sorry, go ahead.
So in some sense, the banks, or at least some of the banks, had won way before through their governments, because obviously Deutsche Bank is affiliated with Germany, had influenced and pressured on the Greek state to essentially buy out that actually toxic debt and make it into a public debt, which of course then was shouldered on the shoulders of the Greek citizens.
So it sounds like what happened in America. You guys got forced bailing out the banks.
That's true.
The public bailed out the banks, and
that's true. There's one of the major differences that as of now, from what I remember, the American banks have not only paid back the American government, but the American government actually made a profit.
What about that in Greece? Did that happen?
I don't think so. The banks have recapitalized. I'm not so sure basically whether they paid that money back. But with respect to the United States, obviously, if you're a private company, and if you had a private company and you went bankrupt, right? No one expects you to get a handout from the government, but apparently if you're big enough to fail, you do get that handout, and that of course creates pervert incentives, because that means that you can take risks that you shouldn't otherwise because you feel that you're going to get bailed out. That's the bad precedent. You know?
Can I ask a question here? What is the what do you think the relationship is between capitalism and democracy?
The thing is that, like, you know, this term has been used like for so many different like ways, in so many different ways that I felt.
You mean capitalism?
Yeah,
or?
I felt in some sense it has lost part of its meaning, or perhaps its entirety. And the same goes, unfortunately, for like communism. I mean, these were two terms that so much propaganda has been spilled around those, that in some sense what you're seeing now is you're seeing people suggest policies that in other times would be called capitalists, but today they sound fresh and nice, because you have to understand that what we have, for some people, what we have today is not even capitalism, right? What you have essentially is like state capitalism or cronyism. That is not really a free market, and essentially capital is controlled by either the corporations or the banks. So some people would object to castigating and haranguing capitalism for what we are up against by saying that this is not capitalism.
Interesting.
But at the same time, I mean, one of the things that has to be mentioned is that we have to become a bit more conscious with respect to certain externalities of the system that we put in place, right? So if a certain system, even when it works right, creates enormous inequalities, and it seems like whatever governments or the governments that have followed what we at least today call capitalism or capitalistic systems, they produce massive inequalities. I mean, you probably know the latest Oxfam study revealed that I think it was 6 or 8 people in the world right now have as much wealth as 3.6 billion people.
Whoa! Can you repeat that?
Yeah, this is a true study. In 2016, it was, I think, 62 people. It's an Oxfam study, and it said the 62 richest people in the world had as many as 3.5 billion people who are poor. Right?
Insane.
And then in 1 year,
insane.
That went from 65 or 62 to 6, and we know who those people are, of course. And the number went from the six richest people in the world on as much as 3.6 billion poor of the world. So when you have these kinds of inequalities, it's very hard for people to achieve consensus, because the people who live in such disparate circumstances literally do not have common interests. And this is one thing that, going back to ancient Greek democracy, equality is a fundamental ingredient of a functioning democracy. If you are vastly unequal in education, in wealth,
didn't Plutarch say something about that?
What?
Plutarch said something about that, didn't he? He said something about how every great empire, what undermines it more than anything else was the vast inequality between the rich and the poor. Something to that.
I mean,
I'm butchering it, but
if he has, you're right, because I mean there is bibliography saying that you pay for that inequality. You pay in more police force. You pay in a handouts that you have to give. You pay. It's not just a moral issue. It's also a financial issue. Inequality causes problems. And that's why I think there's a book called The Spirit Level, right? You've probably seen it. It's about the equality and inequality and the price that we pay to be unequal. So we have reached this point where our inequality is causing so much problems, so many problems that we have to rethink how it is that we function. And don't get stuck necessarily on the labels as communism and capitalism, but get stuck on what is it that we are trying to solve, what problems do we have, and what would be the best approach, irrespective of where it comes from in the political spectrum, to solve the problems that we have without creating harder problems.
Do you have any opinions on that?
Sure, yeah, I do. There's a philosopher called Karl Popper. Many of you probably know him. He wrote The Open Society and Its Enemies. He mentions this difference in two kinds of approach in changing the world. One of them he talked about, he called it utopian engineering. And what utopian engineering is this impulse that some people have, that when they're living in conditions that are very hard, they have this tendency to want to change everything. Right? It's natural. If you have to work 2 jobs, or if you don't have a job, and you see massive inequality, you see corruption, you see crime, you have this tendency to say, okay, the system's at fault, let's just change everything because I can't take it anymore. But the problem is that when you do change everything, you change all kinds of parameters that make it very difficult to assess whether the changes that you're making actually have any impact.
Because you can't measure a bunch of changes all at once.
Exactly.
Right.
So what Popper basically suggested is that instead of trying to aim for an abstract good by changing everything, what you should be doing instead is you should be doing what's called piecemeal social engineering, which is trying to get to the most concrete evils that exist in society and try to change them. Because when you try to change concrete evils, you actually know your impact because you can see that evil kind of like diminishing. We're in this strange situation right now. We're hearing a gaida being played in Pnyx, which in some sense is beautiful.
I think we call it bagpipes in America.
Yeah.
Or in Scotland or whatever.
Yeah. It's really amazing because even like despite like all these issues, you have a lot of people from all over the world trying to come here and not only see the sights but bring some culture of their own. So actually, it's a very nice moment.
So the name of the show is called Surviving Capitalism.
Yes.
What does that mean to you?
It does sound a bit post-apocalyptic. I have to say, But
not trying.
you don't have to see it that way, though. I mean, in some sense, capitalism is here, right? And it's not only here, but it's pretty much all over. And whatever it is that you mean by that term, there's something that everybody can understand is common among the developed nations. So it's not something you can just wish away. It's something that you have to not only survive, but try hard to reform, if not change altogether. Perhaps though not too fast, because as we both know, when things happen too fast, there's a tendency to get out of control and cause more harm than good.
Like a freight train stopping too sudden.
Yeah, I mean, there is a system. And if you are not careful, you might cause more harm than good. And it's not only about surviving capitalism; it's about like flourishing in whatever it is that comes next. So I would want that to happen without any major catastrophes along the way.
Interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
So yeah, I'm happy that you're trying to do this series because people will hear that term and try to like attack it or kind of like respond to it from different perspectives.
Everyone's got a different view.
Yeah, and it's good that you're not actually trying to feed it. And this is something that I'm gonna say on camera because perhaps people think that we had a chat before, but we never had a chat as what it is that this phrase means. You left it wide open, and therefore that gives the space for the person who's responding to actually respond with his own voice rather than yours. So appreciate that.
Thanks. If you could give any advice to anyone around the world about anything, it doesn't matter, what would you, or you want to say anything to the world, what would it be?
What I would say is, I guess I wouldn't put a number on it because I was thinking about two things. But yeah, perhaps two things. One of them is that there's other people like you out there, and you can use the internet to discover them. You're not alone. What you see on the mainstream media is not everything that exists in the world. There's a bunch of online communities, whether it has to do with politics or technology or sociology. I mean, check out the amazing work that is done by a number of nonprofits, whether it's a peer-to-peer foundation or whether it's like an Electronic Frontier Foundation or a number of foundations that talk about like democracy and participatory processes. There are people out there and mechanisms. I mean, sometimes these things are completely open source. For example, I don't know if you know this concept of liquid democracy.
Sure.
We talked about it privately, but not on camera. So I think like the Pirate Party of Sweden has software that they've built, that they've provided open source for you to implement liquid democracy like immediately within your own organization. There's other products like Lumio by Inspiral that also helps you make decisions as a group. So all these things that we talk about is not just theory. There are people who are actively using like tools that are not like mainstream, but are helping you to live a different way than what other people or what like at least the mainstream would say. So that's one thing. Okay, so there's people out there like you, and you got to reach out to them and start talking because they not only exist but they have tools, and you're not alone. Second thing is that you have to remember that not only are you not alone in terms of like people who are alive today, but you're not alone in terms of like global intellectual history. Like there's other people who have had ideas like yours, and many times they've gave their lives to them, and they wrote books, they wrote biographies, autobiographies, or they wrote works, and you can read about them and kind of like get some of that spirit, because it reminds me of this quote by, I think it's called the History Boys, and there's a character in there called Hector, where he says that the greatest moments in reading are those when you come across a thought that you thought was particular to you, and there you see it on a page, written by someone else, perhaps long time dead, and when you see it, when you see that thought that is exactly like yours, written by someone else, it's as if a hand reaches out and touches yours. So there are people out there, perhaps dead thousands of years ago, that have lessons that they can still teach us, and you should not ignore everything that has been written in the past and focus only on the tools of today and what you can build tomorrow, because we don't want to repeat the same mistakes. Some discussions that we had with Brad perhaps a few days ago had to do with for example, the 60s and the 70s, and some people in the United States, they were sick with the system, and they tried essentially to make their own system in communes. It was one of the biggest migrations of young people in America. So they left to the big cities and then went to create their own communes. And what they discovered there is that they tried to essentially have flat hierarchies, like not have like the kind of pyramid structures that they had encountered in politics or the corporate world. But what they didn't account for, and this is why I stress on being historical, they didn't account for power. Whether you want it or not, whenever you try to do something and you form a group, there's going to be power dynamics. You can't legislate power out of existence. If you legislate it formally, it will appear informally. So you have to be aware of how you manage power and how you distribute it to have kind of society that's better than this one. But you can't just wish it away or deny it. We have to be more aware of how, when we find ourselves in positions of power, we change. There's even a book about it called the hubris syndrome. That was written by a member of the Blair cabinet, I think, where I think he was an MD, he was a doctor. And when he got into government, he said, look, I found myself changing in government, having that power. And he mentioned that it's not really like your individual characteristics that matter as much, because you saw people that were good turn into people who were greedy or whatnot. But it's the structures that you find yourselves in, structures of power that you've created, that affect you into becoming something that you otherwise wouldn't be. So you have to be careful. You can't turn into a healthy person if you find yourself into a political Chernobyl, You can't. So you have to be aware that, unfortunately, even if you try to be a good person, if you put yourself in structures that don't reinforce the right sort of behaviors or give too much power to people, power corrupts, unfortunately. And as Lord Acton said, the absolute power corrupts absolutely. So we have to be very careful into not repeating the same mistakes that happened in the past, and be aware that power has to be explicit. It has to be distributed properly if we want it to work. Sometimes it makes sense for there to be hierarchies. If you're in I remember as a sailor, there's this famous quote that sometimes they say, there's no democracy on a sailboat. Right? I mean, if you're in a difficult situation and you're about to drown, you don't take a vote with respect to what's going to happen, like the captain takes a decision. But just because on a certain particular circumstance, a very kind of like hierarchical leader-based system is functional, that doesn't mean that in all other circumstances we should follow that. So we have to be aware as to what kind of leadership is necessary according to the situations that we face and the people that we are, and the people that we want to become. So that's it.
One last question.
Yeah.
Do you have hope for society, democracy at large?
We're alive, so as long as we're alive, we hope. You can't live without hope. I mean, you can, but it's gonna be a miserable existence. Look at this. We're in a beautiful day, and even though it's a bunch of ruins in some sense, we're still trying to restore it, right? So that could be a good symbol. We try to restore not only the building but also the ideals of democracy. So I think we should keep doing that, and perhaps we'll see a better day.
Thanks.
Sure.
Have a good one.